Can you talk a little bit about the way in which whiteness affects, you've talked a little bit about this, but the way in which whiteness is affected or shaped by other forms of identity, class identity, gender identity, religious identity. Um,
Yeah, it's very tempting to conclude that uh, whiteness is the one and only, that it explains everything. But women, most notably, will remind you that white women are not the same as white men, and that sexism remains an issue in our country in terms of access to jobs and access to equal pay, but also in vulnerability to sexual harassment and sexual assault. So I would say that gender is the first big difference. And right after that is class. And if we had a serious discussion of the meanings of whiteness among poor white people, we would learn a whole lot. Right now, on one hand, there's kind of a romanticization of poor rural white people, along with a denigration of poor rural white people. And that has roots way back in the 20th century when eugenics was so important. And this is part of the demographic panic after the First World War. And then the question of who should be allowed to increase, who should be allowed to have children. That's really important. Very often it's assumed that eugenics, because some of it could be murderous, was aimed at people of color. Eugenics was aimed at people of color, but the most obvious targets were poor white people.
there is a way in which the borders of whiteness have to be policed, and that there, even within the category of whiteness, there are suspect categories because of religious identity, because of class identity, because of ideology. Right? There's always been this idea that those that ascribe to socialism are suspect, maybe race traitors, suspicious white people, and there's tremendous pressure among those categories to pay fealty to the privileged status of whiteness, and sort of a guarding of those boundaries, which are so important, and also disciplining of groups that are viewed as suspect, maybe.
Again, the panic after the First World War, going hand in hand with the Russian Revolution and the upwelling of worker power after the First World War. And you mentioned my book, Standing in Armageddon, the United States, 1877 to 1919. It ends in 1919, a year of tremendous upheaval, not simply another coronavirus kind of panic with the flu, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, but also a panic over working power and worker organization. So the racist association with immigrants was attached to the idea of, then the word was Bolsheviks or anarchists. Communist comes later, but right down in the 20th century, conservatives or reactionaries who were trying to hold off Black civil rights always held the flag of communism. They always said, this is communist, this is bad because it's communist.
How did ideas about race evolve after the emancipation of slavery?
We have to keep in mind that we're talking about a country that has like three big parts to it that are different. One big part, which is very much affected, is what had been the Confederacy. And their whiteness is really important because it oppresses Blackness, it polices Blackness. In the West, whiteness is something that polices people of Asian background in murderous ways. So the driving out of the Chinese, for instance. And then the first law that limits immigration and naturalization, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So that's another regime of whiteness. And then there's the North and New England, which is a regime of whiteness in which different kinds of white people count for more than Black people. So, because there are not very many Black people at this point in the late 19th century. So when we think about what whiteness meant after the Civil War, we need to keep in mind that we have three different areas and three different targets of discrimination, actually, and racism. So right after the end of the Civil War, we have not only Juneteenth, but also the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that legally, at least, open citizenship to non-white men. And so that is an enormous difference, and not only makes the classification of whiteness vis-a-vis Blackness more salient, it also signals a long-running campaign to discriminate against, I was going to say Black people, but it's a larger group of people, non-white people. So in the South, there was something called Reconstruction, which was political and social. And that's the 1870s. And I think it would be very good for Americans now to revisit what happened during Reconstruction. This is something that I did in my first book, Exodusters, to talk about what changed and how it changed. So for instance, in Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, in a place like Louisiana, access to literacy makes a huge difference in terms of citizenship and citizenship rights. So Reconstruction was a moment of renewed democracy. The democracy before the Civil War was what's sometimes called a Herrenvolk democracy, a democracy of only some people. So before the Civil War, approximately a 10th, a 12th or so of the American population was enslaved. They had not only no wages, and they couldn't marry, and they couldn't decide about their jobs. They couldn't vote, and they had no money, they had no power. Those people were not living in a democracy. Those people were living in enslavement. After the Civil War, there are all these readjustments during Reconstruction, and the adjustments are in the direction of democracy, and they'd face a tremendous backlash. And the backlash is, we see it politically, but the means of enforcing the political backlash, the main means was terrorism. And we need to be able to see terrorism. We have recently been looking at the massacre in Tulsa 100 years ago. And that has been known about for almost 100 years. It has not been considered American history. It was considered African-American history for a long time, as racial massacres have been. So the period after the Civil War in Reconstruction, a period advancing towards democracy, and then facing a backlash that was political, often terroristic, and social as well. So there came into use the phrase social equality. And social equality meant Black people in the public sphere as equals to white people. So, for instance, transportation was one of the main places in which social equality was policed, so that Black people were Jim Crowed into specific spaces in transportation, which were usually dirty and unkempt. However, if a Black person were clearly a servant, then that person was not subject to the policing of social equality. Social equality was used as a reason why Black men could not be active as citizens, because to vote would be, by this reasoning, to exercise social equality. It was a reason why Black children couldn't have access to good schools with non-Black children, because supposedly that was social equality. Why jobs were limited, just a whole array of positions within public life were set aside in the late 19th and early 20th century for white people, on the grounds that to change them or to open them would be permitting social equality. It was all about access to jobs, access to the vote, just a whole body of, positions within the public sphere set aside for white people. So Reconstruction as a moment reaching towards real democracy, and then slapped down politically, socially, culturally, and the rise of not only a very narrow politics, but also ideologies of culture that said, there are no Black people here, or excuse me, if there are Black people here, they are servants and they are happy here. Or also just the unstated naturalizing of all white spaces. And that carries into the 20th century, that all white spaces are natural, ordinary, fine. And where you can see that most clearly in terms of policy is in suburbanization. So the suburbs were, they didn't happen to be all white. They were white lined. There were restrictive covenants. The FHA, for instance, which made a tremendous difference in Americans' ability to get mortgages. To get a fixed rate 30-year mortgage was a really big deal in the 50s. And those mortgages, those federally supported mortgages, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, were Jim Crow. And I know this from my own family history in California in the 50s. So all white spaces became normalized in the early 20th century, and we can see outgrowths in extremes, such as the commemoration of Confederate generals, the pushing, not just the acceptance, but the pushing of racial segregation and exclusion in the early 20th century.